Hello and welcome to another edition of Dialogue. I'm Philip Klein, and today we're going to be talking about income inequality. Joining me today is Scott Winship of the Manhattan Institute, who's out with a new paper on the subject. And I just wanted to start off with a very basic question. Is it fair to say that over the past few decades we've seen a rise of inequality?
Yeah, I think there are very few people who would dispute that. There's some disagreement about just how much it's risen. You can find numbers. The official Piketty and Saez numbers say the top 1% got 10% of all income in 1979, and that went up to 24% by 2007. On the other hand, you can look at, say, wage and salary income, and that went from about 4 to about 9, I think, over the same period. So, but it's pretty well established that there's been a real increase.
Now, President Obama has said our country cannot succeed when a shrinking few do very well and a growing many barely make it. How do you respond to that sort of rhetoric?
Yeah, so the administration clearly took the inequality frame in 2012 and ran with it. I think the evidence doesn't support those sorts of apocalyptic statements. There's an even better quote by Thomas Piketty where he says something like, in the future only the untalented rich will be able to make it, and the children of the disadvantaged will be penniless. And so there are really these dire scenarios that are painted, but when you really look at the evidence, it's not at all clear that inequality reduces upward mobility. The evidence is that it increases economic growth. So I don't think there's anything that's really backing those sorts of statements.
Now, on that line, you have this new study out where you looked at evidence from a number of countries, and you found that basically that inequality doesn't correlate with reduced prosperity. Could you explain those findings?
Sure. I think there's this sense, including in the quote from the president, that countries that have more inequality, that necessarily ends up taking money from the middle class and from the poor. And so if that's right, then you ought to see across countries that high inequality countries have worse off middle class populations and poor populations. So what I did in this paper was to try to look at inequality measured a few different ways, both inequality kind of within the 99%, if you think about it in Occupy Wall Street terms, and inequality between the top 1% and everyone else. And what you find if you do that, if you look at all of the countries across the world and just fit a straight line through these points, that it does look like the countries that have more inequality have poorer populations. But of course, what's driving this is the developing world, essentially. And when you split off the developed world from the developing world, you actually find that countries with more inequality tend to have better off middle classes. And I go through and demonstrate this with 2 or 3 different data sets, and then talk about how that might be, because it's so unintuitive to people.
But isn't there sort of a distinction between saying that two people are unequal and the person at the lower rung just can't meet sort of basic essentials? Like it seems to me that there's a difference between saying one person has a nicer house than the other person, whereas another person is homeless. When you look at that sort of data over the years, where do you see that in terms of the standard of living?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and that's partly why I wrote the paper, was because you tend to see these statements, and I quote Joe Stiglitz, for instance, in the paper, where they say, the U.S. inequality levels are getting so severe that our neighbors are kind of Nigeria and some really poor countries.
I think it's the level of inequality that marks dysfunctional societies. It is a club that we would distinctly not want to join, including Iran, Jamaica, Uganda, and the Philippines.
That's right. So that sounds like a club that we would not want to join, except for the fact that our middle class and our poor populations are multiple times better off than in these countries. And a few of them, I think it's something like a factor of 10. And so you really do find that in the rich countries that incomes are just a lot higher than in the developing world. And you get this real distinct pattern where English-speaking countries, the UK, Ireland, Canada, Australia, and the US tend to have more inequality but higher living standards. Continental Europe seems to be the only place where, if you look at all the countries that are there, that having more inequality actually correlates with having poorer populations. So that's kind of the outlier of all the different ways that I looked at it.
But and the question is, though, is there a certain amount of inequality that's inevitable over time, in the sense that a person has lower income is going to spend a higher percentage of their income on basic necessities, whereas somebody who's wealthy, who has more money to play around with, could put it in investments and put in more investments that have high returns and sort of expand that money. So isn't, over time, there's sort of going to naturally be this trend?
I think that's right, yeah, and that was part of what Thomas Piketty's book was concerned about, I think. A case could be made, I think Scott Sumner at The Money Illusion has made it best, which is that investment income shouldn't really be thought of as being like other income, because it's money that people put away and decided not to use for consumption. And in return for getting returns on it, they are without those funds. And so in some ways, the higher investment income that folks get at the top is just to compensate them for having not spent it previously. And that's why I like to look at the kind of wage and salary income instead, which is a lot less alarming than more comprehensive measures that include investment income.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that you note in your piece is that it could be argued that having the ability to have huge rewards could also spark innovation.
Yep, that's right. And I think that's one of the reasons why we find that countries with more inequality actually have better off populations below the top. The research shows that in rich countries, again, you have to split them off from the developing world, that having more inequality, having bigger increases in inequality, actually seems to go hand in hand with bigger increases in income for the middle class and for the poor. And the reason is that if the economy grows more because of having more inequality, then even if the middle and the poor have a skinnier slice of the pie has enlarged enough that they're still better off. Ultimately, what we want is for everybody to have more pie. And so that I think is the explanation that I offer in the paper.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the big arguments that's always gone on between the left and the right has been about this distinction between income inequality and income mobility. This idea that even if, let's say, the bottom 20% is earning a smaller share of the overall amount of money, it's not going to be the same people that are in the bottom 20%. Where do you think that, if you look at the mobility statistics over the past few decades, if that paints a more positive picture for the United States?
I'd say yes and no. So I think to people who argue that having more inequality actually lowers mobility, and Janet Yellen was the last person to do it last week. The problem there is that in this period where income inequality has risen, mobility has not fallen. Now, to be clear, it's not increased either. But as you say, there is a fair amount of mobility over the course of careers. So if you look at folks separated 10 years apart, the same people both times, you tend to find that of the people who were at the bottom in the first period, 10 years later, about 60% of them have left the bottom. Now, it's rare to move big distances over 10 years, but there is a really important life cycle component to all this.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you look on the Piketty book, one thing that struck me as curious reading through that was that he argues that essentially in the first part of the 20th century, there had been this shrinking of inequality, and that people erroneously thought that this was going to continue forever, and sort of validated capitalism. Whereas he argued that, well, that was just a snapshot, and as we saw in the decades that followed, income inequality rose. Mm-hmm. But couldn't he be making the same mistake, in the sense that he's assuming that what we've seen over the last few decades is where the 21st century is leading to? But could he be overlooking certain trends that might cut against rising inequality.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's always dangerous to project what's happened the last few years into the future. And just to kind of give one scenario for how you can imagine the level of inequality, income concentration at the top, at least stabilizing, maybe not declining, is in some ways, if you think about the last 30, 35 years, as this new era when married women kind of entered the workforce. We became prosperous enough that we could afford to do that and to pay for childcare and things like that. Women have been increasing their educational attainment for decades, and finally are able to put their human capital to work. So what may have happened is that there was a period where we actually didn't want any married women to work, and men received this kind of breadwinner premium to try to raise a family on one income, which was an ideal for decades, something that unions fought pretty hard for. But now you don't actually pay a husband and a wife both enough to raise a family on one income, and so we've seen men's wages stagnate to an extent and lag productivity increases. And there's been this great correction while productivity catches up to these inflated male wages. Well, if that period of correction wraps up, then you might expect to see men's pay start to increase more, and then you could see the share of income going to the top level off. That's one example, but I do think you're absolutely right. Piketty, not only did he assume current trends will continue, but he took the worst possible scenario and then presented that as almost a fait accompli, I think.
Now, liberals trying to sort of, in the name of combating inequality, have proposed a number of different policy changes, ranging from, in Obama's case, a Buffett rule tax, in Piketty's case, a global wealth tax. Obviously, the minimum wage is a big issue, big push for expanding labor unions. What do you think of these policies? Which do you think are some of the ones that would be most damaging to economic development?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. A number of them, done modestly, probably wouldn't do a ton of damage. You can imagine increasing the minimum wage a bit, and it would knock some people out of work, but it would boost the wages of some other people. Raising it to $10.10 an hour would be historically unprecedented. The minimum wage today, if it was at its 1968 level, if you measure the cost of living and how that's increased correctly, it would be $8.35 today. So 10.10 is something we've never seen, and I do worry a lot about that, let alone $15 in Seattle. Similarly, I think there's this idea that Piketty and Saez have promoted that the optimal top tax rate is over 70%. I think two things would happen if we ever had a top tax rate that high. One, there would be some damage because a lot of people would choose to work less, take less risk. But the other thing that would happen is the money would still go to these folks. They would just find ways to shelter it, and so you wouldn't actually even get the revenue. And for some people, the point isn't to get any revenue at all. It's just to say we don't want anybody to make above this. We think that's some line we don't want to cross. I think it's a mistake. I think, again, the research shows that when you have more inequality, actually there's more income growth at the middle and the bottom.
Given the sort of rise of populism on both the right and left, do you think that the inequality issue is only going to grow, or do you think it's sort of an issue that is sort of big for a year or two and it's going to sort of recede as an issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of years ago, I would have said that the Democrats were going to go all in with inequality in 2016. I don't think they will now, partly because the economy has gotten quite a bit better, and I think will continue to get better. But also the likely Democratic nominee is going to have a hard time talking about inequality herself, I think. But I do think that inequality has been this boogeyman for a lot of economic frustration and insecurity as a consequence of the Great Recession. I don't think it was particularly deep-seated anxiety about inequality to begin with. And I think it's going to be even less so moving forward as the economy continues to improve.
But I mean, I guess, do you think part of that is just the sort of old thing that if there are a lot of people in a time of bad economy who aren't doing well, a politician can come along and say sort of, you're not doing well while this other person's getting fat and rich.
Yep, it's an attractive political message from the left for sure. Bill de Blasio successfully wrote it into the mayor's office. If Elizabeth Warren does end up running for higher office, I think she'll certainly lean hard on that. And it does, even I think if you're not concerned about inequality yourself as a voter, if you're worried about other people, and inequality seems like a convenient way to express your worry about the disadvantaged, it's an attractive frame, but I think it would be counterproductive for folks that do want to help those at the bottom.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure we'll be following the inequality debate a lot going forward.
Absolutely.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of Dialogue. See you next time.